Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another Survivor What If video, this time talking about what if every merge boot won every immunity challenge. Now this is a topic that I'm not going to go super in depth on every single situation, because obviously that would take so much time to literally run through every merge phase of the game. However, this is more so a look at how I feel like the merge boots would have done and who they would have gotten to the end with had they been able to somehow win out from the merge on. And again, who I quantify as the merge boot is the person who was voted out at the first tribal with all the players voting together. So again, that might lead to some differences in terms of what the general thought is on who the merge boot is. But again, we'll talk about it as we move on. So let's get started. Let's start off with Survivor Borneo, where we have Gretchen Cordy winning out. And I think this is probably one of the easier ones. And to be honest, a lot of these seasons with pagongings lead to pretty easy scenarios. Well, obviously, Gretchen would just be the last of the talkies remaining. If Kelly Wigglesworth wavers like she does in real life, then she probably gets voted out at 6, followed by Sean at 5. At 4 could be interesting, considering I do think she would team up with Sue to go against Rich and Rudy, but to be honest, it doesn't really matter because Gretchen wins at the end anyway. I think Gretchen wins against anybody if she gets to the end, as she already has the votes of the 3 Pagong members in Jervis, Jenna, and Colleen, again now assuming Greg is the merge boot. While also the vote of Kelly Wigglesworth will more than likely go to Gretchen as well. So again, she more than likely wins against anybody. Next up for Australian Outback, we do have Varner, who him winning immunity would greatly benefit the Coochas here, as he's the only Coocha with a vote. And through that, it would definitely give them an advantage. It would allow them to vote for Keith, who they assumed had votes, to which he would go home in the tiebreaker. And even if they end up picking the wrong person, still go for Colby, they'll at least go to a tiebreaker challenge. So Coocha definitely has the advantage there. If Coocha obviously continues the pagonging, then I do think Jeff and Eliza are in the winning position, considering Nick is someone that is closer to them than they are to Roger and Elizabeth. The problem is I think there's a likely chance that they vote out Nick at 5. But even then, again, they're facing off against Elizabeth and Roger in a tiebreaker at 4. I just think they have the odds to make it to the end, during which I think it's a question mark on who wins. It's a bit of an unknown. Next up for Survivor Africa, we have Clarence winning out. And this one's a bit interesting because I think a lot of it is dependent on whether or not Kelly Goldsmith would still flip. Now, in the real life situation, she is incentivized to flip after Lex goes on this witch hunt after the merge vote because of the vote that T-Bird puts on Lex. However, obviously in this situation, that's not happening yet. So does Kelly Goldsmith still flip at the merge here? It's a bit unknown, but even then, like, is Brandon voting with that group? I mean, I think it's going to be very tough to get the Samburu group together, even though they could potentially put the votes together by adding in Kelly Goldsmith and Clarence. But really, I feel like Clarence is someone that's never winning a jury vote. Even if he gets to the end, I just don't think he had the respect on this season to win. Now, obviously, he could gain some respect through him winning competitions, but I'm just a bit unsure whether or not Clarence would even gain that respect from doing so. To the point where, like, even if he had taken someone like a Kim Johnson to the end, I could definitely see Kim Johnson pulling out the win, especially having the backing of Lex and Ethan and probably like a Kim Powers. And I just find it tough to see Clarence winning the game, even if he were to somehow make it to the end there. Next up for Survivor Marquesas, and here we have Boston Rob winning out from the merge. And really, I feel like for most of the game, you could just swap out Rob and Sean. I think Sean is the boot at the merge. Rob probably takes Sean's place in the alliance that flips against the Road to 4, as obviously at that point, they can't really do much to take out Rob, who I think Pascal and Nelio were very incentivized to do. So at that point, I think they probably would work with him, especially at the point where they noticed that the Road to 4 was getting as cocky as they were. But Rob obviously doesn't have as much of a loyalty to Vesepia there. I do think there's definitely a chance that he ends up aligning with Kathy, though I feel like he would also recognize that Nalia is the most beatable at the end. But I do feel like Rob is another one that I have a tough time seeing him win, unless the immunity run itself garners him a lot of respect, where I think Rob was someone that was very villainized while out there, where you even hear about how much Nelly and Pascal didn't like Rob just because of what Gina told them. And obviously he already burnt his relationships with a lot of the Road to 4. So it's like, I don't know if Rob can even win if he gets to the end. I think especially against Kathy, he would probably lose. Even against Nalia, there's definitely a chance he would lose. Like, I do feel like he's someone that, if he wins at the end, it definitely would have to be due to people respecting the amount of competitions he won. Next up for Survivor Thailand, we have Ken, and this one's pretty easy because, again, we had a straight pagonging. Ken would obviously win out. And to be honest, it doesn't really matter who he goes up against, as he more than likely wins. as he would obviously have the 3 Sukjai votes locked in. He would just need one more, and considering the resentment that was there towards Brian or even Clay by the end game, 2 people that he's most likely to be sitting next to, I feel like there's probably going to be at least one vote that ends up switching there. I feel like against Brian, I think Ted could easily switch there. I think against Clay, probably a lot of people switch there. So again, I think Ken is a pretty likely winner there. Next up for the Amazon, we do have Roger winning out, which I think a lot of this game plays out similarly, just swapping Butch with Roger. However, Roger's obviously a much more volatile personality, and through that could definitely cause a lot of drama along the way. But I think Roger's another one that I don't think he wins against anybody, and I think this even more so than like with Rob and Clarence. I think there's no way Roger even gains the respect to win, considering how he was just looked at as such a misogynistic figure while out there. And while he more than likely gets to the end against people that are not super likable in like a Matthew or a Christie, I still feel like they would probably win in a jury vote against him. Next up, we're moving on to Andrew Savage, and this one could be interesting. I mean, one, I feel like most of his alliance gets picked off early, right? Like, I feel like Rhino is probably the merge vote in that situation. Probably get like Tawana going home next, maybe Dara 1-2. I think Savage probably sides with Rupert instead of Johnny Fairplay, unless Fairplay decides to make the move early and somehow pulls it off at like 9 or something. But I can definitely see Savage writing it out with the Rupert, Sandra, Christos of the world at that point. And also at that point, I think Savage wins against anybody. Like, I don't think he would have trouble beating anyone except for maybe Rupert, but even then, Rupert was not as well respected as the edit would make you think, to where, yeah, I feel like Savage would definitely win. He obviously has the 2 votes of the former Morgans, plus also Fairplay and Burton, which is already enough to give him the win. Next up, moving on to Lex from Survivor All-Stars. And again, I think this is another situation. Pagong still happens. Kathy, Sheehan, probably Alicia go home back to back to back. The question at that point is, can Lex flip the game against Rob and Amber? Can he flip Jenna, Rupert, and Tom against Rob and Amber? And I don't know. Like, I think there's a world where he flips over Tom, but Rupert and Jenna and Rob and Amber obviously had a Final Four. I don't think Rupert turns his back on that at that point. So while I do feel like Lex would have tried to get to the end with Big Tom, I think he probably ends up going to the end against Jenna, I guess, considering obviously at 5 he would have been able to flip it, considering it would have been the 2 pairs against each other. And I think Jenna's his easiest beat there. And yeah, I do think Lex wins at the end. Next up, moving on to Rory. And I think for the most part, Rory just takes Chris's spot. Obviously, just being in worse position considering he's not as good of a player. Where can Chris survive that final 8 round? I don't know. I suspect probably not. But if somehow they're able to survive that round and get Twyla and scout the flip, then I think Rory would take Chris to the end and probably lose to him. If not, then he's probably aligning with the Twyla and Scouts in the end game and probably winning against them. I think almost for sure would win against Twyla. I think Scout's a bit more of a question mark, but it's funny to think that there's a world where Rory could be the Chris Doherty figure on a season. Now moving on to Palau, where again, like, this is kind of a wonky situation. Where's the merge? But I'm going to consider Kobe the merge boot. And here, I mean, I think one Steph goes out first. I think Kobe then tries to flip the game on Tom and Ian by getting the Katie, Jen, and Greg's on his side. Would also have Janu at that point. And if he's successful, I think he probably takes either Katie or Jen to the end, or Janu if she doesn't decide to quit at one point, to which he would probably end up winning. Unless there's a very anti-Kobe sentiment from the Tom and Ians in Ponderosa. And to be honest, even if his flip failed, he probably still takes Katie to the end, to which he probably also still wins, though Katie definitely would get votes in that situation. Next up, moving on to Guatemala, where we have Brandon winning out, and I think the Pagong is mostly the same. It's just that obviously Brandon is the last one standing instead of Danny. And to be honest, most of the game just in general probably stays the same. He probably still gets the 3 with Rafe and Steph. And considering Brandon seemed like a competent player, I would assume he would take Steph to the end and win. But either way, again, he's another one of these people that has like 3 locked in jury votes in Gary, Danny, and Brandon. Would only need 1 more. I think he could easily get it. I think he's more than likely the winner. Next up, we're moving on to Nick Stanberry from Panama. And really, I think this is a situation where you just swap him with Terry, and I think most of the game plays out the same. Now, obviously, Terry does have the idol, so the question is, do they take out Terry, or do they create the plan of splitting the vote, which they would have been able to execute at the final 8? Again, who knows? But let's just assume the game plays out similarly to the final 4. Though without Ars having immunity, then obviously it becomes Ars versus Danielle in firemaking. And more than likely, he takes Danielle to the end if she does win the firemaking challenge. If she doesn't, he takes Suri. And either way, I think he probably would win. Again, he has the Lamina votes. That's 3 already. Against Danielle, he would probably have the votes of Shane and Courtney. And against Surrey, he would probably have the votes of like a Bruce or even a Courtney. So again, where I feel like he would more than likely win. Next up, moving on to Nate from Cook Islands. And here, I think a lot of it's, well, again, very similar. Swap out Nate with Adam, but without Ozzy having immunity, obviously he gets picked off along the way. But also Yule still having the idol by the end. He's still going to be forced to go to the end against Yule and probably loses, though it's actually not really a guarantee here, as would Adam be more incentivized to keep his word with the Penner deal in this situation where he's obviously has a much better personal relationship with Nate. And also Ozzy could very likely vote for Nate as well here. So I do think Nate actually probably has an advantage against Yule due to losing those very integral votes there. Next up, moving on to Fiji, where again, this is a bit of a weird one. I'm going to consider Edgardo the merge boot here instead of Michelle Yee. And again, Edgardo's in another situation. His allies get booted, Alex and Mookie. Yao probably gets taken out earlier than what he normally would, considering he needed to win certain competitions. And we more than likely get to the same final four, just obviously swapping out Yao with Edgardo, which at that point, who goes home? I think that could be a question mark of Edgardo being someone that I think recognized that Earl was a threat. And also Dreams of Cassandra being very close to where, like, would they just vote out Earl at that point? To which Edgardo would have a very easy win. However, if Earl is able to get out of that situation and vote out Dreams, like what it seemed like was almost going to happen in a real life situation, at that point it would have been a pretty close vote between Edgardo and Earl, where Earl has 3 locked votes, Edgardo has 3 locked votes. And really we're left in a situation where Rocky, Stacy, and Boo are the swing votes, to where I do think Stacy probably leans Edgardo. I do think Rocky probably leans Earl, and I don't really have much of a clue really where Boo goes. So I think it is a massive question mark here on who wins, but Edgardo would definitely have a shot. Next up, moving on to China, where we have Jamie winning out. And again, I think here you just swap her out for PG for most situations, with Denise probably being voted out at 5, and then Todd probably being voted out at 4. And in this final 3 situation, Jamie could definitely win, but there's definitely actually even a chance of a Courtney win, maybe Amanda win. Again, like I think a lot of votes are up for grabs here. I mean, obviously Eric and PG would vote for Jamie. Denise and James would definitely vote for Courtney. So then we're left with Frosty, Todd, and Jean Robert, who I think all 3 of them have multiple ways that they can go. I think Todd's probably voting Amanda, but could go Courtney. I think Frosty could really vote for any of the 3. And then Jean Robert's probably in a similar case where he could vote for any of the 3. So yeah, I definitely think it's up for grabs there. Next up, we're moving on to Eliza. And I think the early merge is pretty similar. I think Jason is going to be the first vote here. I think then Ozzy probably still gets flipped on. And probably they just ride it out with her getting to the end with the Black Widow Brigade. To which if she does, where does she go? Assuming Manda still has her idol at 6, you would assume Alexis would still go there, with Natalie going out immediately afterwards. So the question at that point is, who does Eliza take to the end? Where I really don't know. I think there's an argument for why she would take any of the 3. And to be honest, I don't think she wins against any of the 3. I don't think there's a way that Eliza would have had the respect to win the game at that point, considering the makeup of the jury. So really, I feel like she's probably just picking who she loses against. Next up, moving on to Gabon, where here we have Charly as the merge boot, where again, I think the begonging still happens. Randy, Corinne, probably Bob are booted back to back to back, and probably gets into the end game. And considering his rivalry with Kenny, I assume Kenny and Crystal would still end on the bottom after that, to where I feel like he more than likely gets to the end against Maddie and Sugar, especially where there's not a Bob figure to distract Sugar from Maddie. And if that is the case, then obviously Maddie gets the votes of Susie, Crystal, and Ken, while Charly gets the votes of Bob, Corinne, and Marcus, and Randy is essentially the deciding vote, to which I don't know exactly where he goes. I mean, he had a very close personal relationship with Maddie, where I could definitely see him going there, but also Charly was in the alliance that he was a part of by the end of it, to which he also seemed close to. So again, I think it is a question mark. So I would probably lean towards him voting for Charly, just because that's where the rest of his alliance is going. Next, I'm moving on to Token Chains, where again, here I'm considering Brendan the merge boot, because Joe got medevaced. And obviously with Brendan winning here, I think Sierra is probably the one that ends up going home with the merge instead. And beyond that, I think Brendan probably sides with Jalapal moving forward and probably ends up taking JT at the end, considering he openly says that's what he's going to do, to which he would just hand JT the win. And to be honest, he might even just give up his game for JT. He might even just tell everyone to vote for JT at the end, considering that's where I feel like Brendan was in the game at that point. So really, it's probably the same result. Next up for Samoa, we do have Eric winning immunity. And this probably would have been the saving grace for Glue, considering at that point, I think Jason would just be the merge vote. I don't think they would try to flip it onto like a John Fincher or anyone else, to which they would be able to split the vote the very next round against Russell, to where they would probably win out there. Though, to be fair, Shambo could technically mess things up. But, I mean, obviously there would be a lot of variance in that situation. Let's just assume Fofo gets pagonged. And immediately after, I feel like Shambo and John would probably be picked off as the people on the bottom. And at that point, I do think the war between Dave and Laura would probably happen, where I think they would be like the leaders of their two sides. And I do think he would probably end up siding with Dave, to where Dave's number one was Kelly, supposedly, and they probably would have gotten to the end together. And really, I feel like it's probably a battle between him and Dave in terms of who's going to get jury votes. Now, obviously, Kelly could definitely get some votes from like a Laura Moret or even a Monica, but I think it is more than likely between Eric and Dave, to where the Fofo contingent would probably be a major decision maker here. I do feel like Eric would have the votes of Shambo and John, and through Shambo would obviously connect them to the Fofo group. So again, maybe they would vote for Eric, but it really could go either way. Next up are Heroes vs. Villains, where, I mean, I think this one's easy. JT wins out, JT wins the game. Where here, probably Amanda ends up being the merge vote, where Heroes probably still get pagonged for the most part. But really, I feel like JT would easily win against any of the villains, obviously having 4 heroes on the jury, plus also Coach, who's very incentivized to vote for him. That's already enough to win. And that's not even including like the possible vote from like a Sandra if he doesn't get to the end with her, or Courtney, who obviously they had a pregame relationship from the connection to Stephen Fishback. So again, like I think JT is the very clear front runner there. Next up from Survivor Nicaragua, we have Alina winning out. And I mean, this is a bit of a train wreck, but I do think the early merge is mostly the same. I think Marty probably obviously goes home at the merge instead of her. Brenda gets taken out as a threat pretty soon afterwards. I do think in general, though, it's kind of tough to truly gauge, considering this was a mostly dynamic grouping of players, and I don't think Alina had much leverage in the game at this point, to where I feel like the only point where she could have possibly gotten some semblance of control is if she tried to pull together the Benry, Fabio, and Dans of the world. But even then, like, I don't think there's much she could really do. I mean, she's gonna win out, probably get to the end against the Sash, Holly, Chase contingent. They probably still vote out Holly, and to be honest, she probably still loses, considering she had no real respect there. But considering how hated Sash and Chase were as well, I mean, I guess anything's up for grabs. But I do think votes would really go all over the place, and it just being pretty unpredictable on exactly where the votes would go. Next up for Rapture Island, and I mean, this one's easy. We got Matt Elrod winning out, and I think he wins against anybody. I think the pagonging still happens, where Zapatero goes out back to back to back. And really, I think the rest of the game plays out similarly, as I think Andrea's probably voted out first of that group. Rob still takes out Ashley and Grant. I think the choice of does Rob take Philip or Nally to the very end is one that could be interesting, but really doesn't really matter too much, as either way he's getting to the end against Rob, and I think he's probably beating Rob with the majority of the votes, probably only not getting whichever of Nally and Philip is on the jury, and then maybe like an Ashley, maybe like an Andrea, but even then, not super likely. I think Matt is a clear front runner there. Next up for South Pacific, we do have Keith winning out. And really, I feel like he wins against anybody but Ozzy. Really, I feel like most of the season plays out the same. Obviously, the pagonging still happens, where he does get to the end with that core alliance. Brandon's still probably the first one out of that group. Ozzy probably still returns to the game. They probably still vote out Ozzy at 5. The question is who they vote out at 4. I'm inclined to think that they probably vote out Sophie if Sophie doesn't win immunity. At that point, he probably beats Coach and Albert. I mean, I think even if it's Sophie there, I think he still wins anyway. Again, he would obviously have the votes of the old Savaid minus Cochran, and then would also have the votes of people like a Rick and a Brandon. So again, it should be a pretty easy win for him. Next up from One World, we have Jonas, and really I feel like first up, just swap out Jonas with Troyzan. I think that's a portion of the game that plays out mostly similarly, and with Kim still dominating the game, I think really Jonas will just be there for the ride. I think really the end game probably plays out similarly to where he gets the 4 with Kim, Sabrina, Chelsea. I think Kim votes out Sabrina at 4. The question is, would Jonas go after Sabrina at 4, or would he try to get Kim into a fire-making challenge? Who really knows? But if he does get to the end against Kim, I think Kim still demolishes him. I think Kim would still get the votes of Sabrina, Christina, Alicia, Tarzan, Kat, Jay, and Michael. The same votes she gets in real life. While I do think Jonas probably gets Troy and Leaf. However, if he gets to the end against Sabrina, I think it's a lot more up for grabs. Where I think at that point he could potentially get Christina and Alicia's vote. He would obviously need to do some fighting to get the Jay and Michaels, but I think he definitely could win in that situation, but I think against Kim, it's really a non-starter. Next up for Philippines, we have RC winning out, and I mean, this ends up being a really crazy vote off the bat, right? Where now the split can't be against RC, so they probably split it on Jeff Kent, I would assume, considering Carter also had immunity, considering a man and woman could have immunity there. So that would be a crazy tribal. And then after that, I think RC would probably side with the Scoopin and Lisa contingent for a lot of the game, probably siding with Tendang for a few rounds before flipping over, more than likely getting to the end against Scoopin and Lisa, to which if that is the case, I think Lisa would probably win. I mean, RC is someone that obviously was not well liked by her cast. I don't think the artists, Pete's and Abby's of the world were ever voting for RC. I think they probably would have gone Lisa. Denise and Malcolm probably would have gone Scoopin, considering that's what they said at the time. Carter probably goes Scoopin. Penner probably goes Lisa. Jeff Kent probably goes Lisa, maybe RC. But I mean, realistically, I think RC's probably getting shut out here, to where I think probably Lisa ends up winning that vote. Next up, moving on to Karamoan, where here we have Corinne winning immunity. And I think the first vote ends up being pretty interesting, where at that point, do they just blindside Malcolm right away? Where I think that definitely would have been a possibility. Now, obviously, I think more than likely, maybe it just lands on like Eddie or Michael Snow. But I think Malcolm could definitely be blindside there. And really just throughout, I think a lot of the game plays out similarly. Just that you have Corinne staying in the game and kind of being latched on to Dawn. Now, the question is, does Cochran still win? As I think Cochran wins if he gets to the end. But in this situation where Corinne is sticking around, I do think that definitely opens up the possibility of Cochran getting knocked out at some point towards the end game, to which Dawn probably still wins that final 3 between Corinne and Sherry, considering neither Sherry or Corinne were respected. So really, I still think it's a similar game. I still think Cochran or Dawn win, but I do think this increases the chances of Dawn getting to the final 3 without Cochran, to which she would more than likely win. Next time, moving on to Blood versus Water, where if Aris wins out here, obviously Pagang still happens. Vitas, Tina, Katie voted out. And really along the way, probably Aris is trying to lead the votes against Tyson and could potentially get the numbers at some point. I mean, obviously could have eventually gotten like a Hayden and a Caleb and a Sierra, but to be honest, if he's successful or not, it's probably irrelevant, considering he's still probably going to get to the end against Monica and Jervis, and he could win. I mean, obviously he would have the votes of Vitas, Tina, and Katie, but all the other votes I think are very much up for grabs. The votes of Tyson and Sierra, Hayden, and Caleb. I mean, if we're talking about this in a world where Aris is leading the charge against Tyson and eventually gets him out, then obviously I think that would gain him the respect to win. So I think he's the likely winner, but it's definitely not 100% guaranteed. Next for Cagayan, we have Sarah Lucina winning out, and at this point, like, Cass probably doesn't flip. I mean, the main reason she flips is to take out Sarah. With Sarah being immune, she probably doesn't do that. And Sarah's plan the entire time was to get to the end against Jeremiah and Spencer. So I think that's probably the plan that she would have continued on with. Though, obviously, if Tony finds a special idol, that would obviously change things up. And also, I think Morgan is someone that's like a very easy goat, to where I definitely could see Morgan taking the spot of Spencer in particular along the way. Also considering Cagayan was a final 2. If it's against Jeremiah, I think she easily wins. If it's against Morgan, I think she easily wins. I don't think she would take Spencer. I feel like that would be a weird thing for her to do. Take Spencer to a final 2. She could go Cops R Us and go with Tony, to which at that point it's really up in the air, because who knows what type of game Tony plays at that point to get himself to that spot, to where this could be a situation where Sarah is looked at as this like woo type figure. But realistically, I think Sarah is more than likely the winner had she been able to win out. Next up for San Juan del Sur, again, here I'm considering the merge boot, Josh considering, and Julie quit before. And if Josh wins immunity, I think Jeremy is the easy boot at the merge vote, considering John was so hung up on getting rid of Jeremy. But I do think John and Jacqueline flipped the very next round. But I mean, considering again, Josh is safe until the end, and he definitely tries to pull off moves along the way. I think John is for sure gone by the end. He probably tries to go to the end against Jacqueline and Missy, the two biggest perceived goats there, or maybe even Baylor and Missy. But either way, like, he easily wins those scenarios. He obviously has the votes from his own group in the Reed, Keith, Alec and Wes's of the world, which would already be enough against Jacqueline and Missy, considering obviously they would split the votes between their loved ones. And against Missy and Baylor, he'd probably also get the votes of John and Jacqueline. And really, I feel like Josh is a very likely winner in this situation. Next up, moving on to Worlds Apart, here we do have Kelly Remington, and I think Kelly probably stays in the majority alliance with Carolyn, Will, and Rodney moving forward. While I don't think she would actively cut Mike along the way, I do think Mike would have been booted along the way, to which she probably goes to the end against Rodney and Will, and probably ends up winning. I mean, Rodney would definitely have the chance of getting some votes, especially considering the no-callers were not particularly fond of Kelly due to her flipping on them earlier in the game, due to her flipping immediately after her merge. And at that point, like, again, that definitely opens up the road for a Rodney win. But I do think on paper, Kelly feels like the front runner there, but again, could go either way. Next up, moving on to Cass from Survivor Cambodia. And I mean, I think this is just way too turbulent to play out. I mean, for the most part, I think you can swap Sierra and Cass, and at that point, maybe swap out Cass and Kelly. As again, I do think Tasha, Jeremy, Spencer were probably winning out by that end game. So at that point, I think Cass probably would have caused fire making between Jeremy and Spencer. To which, if she gets to the end against Jeremy, I do think Jeremy would still have the votes to win, considering he still had the backing of the Savages of the world, the Stevens of the world, the Kelly Wigglesworth of the world. And comparing it to like the Jeremy versus Kelly situation, I feel like there's a lot of votes that are more so unknown with Cass in that situation, where like people like an Abby and a Kimmy and Keith could really go either way. So I'm inclined to think Jeremy probably wins. But I think against Tasha and Spencer, I feel like she probably wins that. But again, there's really just a lot of unknowns on Cass's relationships with a lot of these people, to where it's not really a guarantee. Next up, moving on to Co Wrong, where here we do have Nick. Again, I am considering him the merge boot because, again, Neil got medevaced. So, first up, I think the Super Idol gets played at this first tribal, where now we're in a position where if Nick doesn't have immunity and the Aubrey and Debbie's of the world lead the charge against Jason and Scott, I think at this point they would have had the leverage with Ty in order to use the Super Idol. So, more than likely Aubrey or Debbie go home, but it would just lead to Jason and Scott being the next boots anyway. And really, again, at that point, the end game is just too turbulent to really figure out. Does Joe still get medevaced? Again, is it Aubrey or Debbie? Because that causes a major difference there as well. I could definitely see Nick getting to the end against, like, maybe Michelle and Debbie, to which, like, Nick could definitely win that. I think at that point, Michelle wouldn't be nearly as respected if she doesn't win the competitions at the end that gained her respect in the end game. And considering Nick does the exact thing that Michelle did, but even better considering he won more immunity challenges, I think Nick is more inclined to win at this point, and also considering he had better relationships with the Jason Scotts of the world. So I'm inclined to think Nick wins in that scenario. Again, if it's Aubrey that somehow squeezes in, or maybe even a tie, I think it becomes a bit closer, but I think Nick is a very likely winner if he did win out. Next up from Millennials vs. Gen X, we do have Michelle winning out, and I mean, the merge vote's probably a pretty easy Taylor vote. I think Michelle probably sides with the Zeke, Jay, Will, Brett, Sunday group, which this split would probably happen at 11 at this point, which means they get the majority. Probably still works alongside Jay and Will, but again, Will probably flip back and forth, so who knows where he's going. But really, I feel like Michelle is kind of like a mid-tier jury threat on this season. Now, obviously, if she wins out, that can gain her some respect, but I still feel like the David, Zeke, and Jays of the world are bigger jury threats on a whole. I do feel like she could possibly win, especially with this underdog story, if she's at the end against a Brett and Sunday, against a Ken and Hannah for sure. Even against an Adam, I think it would be pretty close here, but again, we don't really know exactly how this endgame would have played out. So it makes it tough to gauge, but I don't look at Michelle as a super likely winner, even if she were to win out. Next time, moving on to Game Changers, where here we have Haley winning immunity, which probably leads to an easy Michaela vote out at the merge. Unless Sari would have really tried to fight hard for her, but even then, I don't know if she would have been that successful at that point. And I think for the most part, you could just swap out Haley with Michaela, except that obviously Haley and Sari were not as close. But I do think this leads to Sari probably being taken out at the final 7 round. I guess Brad is out at an advantage getting at this point, considering he wouldn't have won immunity. Haley would win immunity. So if we're talking about this final 5 situation, I think Haley is much more inclined to side with Aubrey and Ty than she is with Troy, Zan, and Sarah. But I mean, again, really, you don't know. I mean, like, whichever side she sides with is more than likely winning. And if she gets to the end against Aubrey and Ty, I think she could pick up some votes, but I do think it's more likely that Aubrey and Ty win, considering they have more locked-in jury votes. And against Sarah and Troy, I mean, at that point, does Sarah play the cutthroat game that she had played? I think probably would win, but again, it definitely would be up for grabs. Next up, moving on to HHH, and here we do have Jessica, and really, I feel like a lot of this early game plays out similarly, just swapping her out for Mike, to where I think she probably gets to the final 5 in the Dr. Mike situation. But again, obviously the Desi, the Joes, the Coles of the world go out back to back to back. Mike gets taken out earlier. Ben gets flipped on, but still idles his way through. I think Devin probably gets voted out at the final 5 at this point, especially where he doesn't really have anyone to split the vote on. I think Jessica probably ends up putting Ben and Chrissy in fire making, to which at that point, who knows who wins that fire making challenge. I think if Jessica gets to the end against Chrissy, I think Jessica easily wins. Having all the healer votes, and even in that situation, probably would have the vote of the Ashleys and Lauren Rimmers of the world. If it's against Ben, I think that's a bit of a closer situation, though I do still think Jessica gets those healer votes, but some of them would have been pretty close to potentially being Ben votes, but I'm still inclined to think that Jessica still wins. Next up, from Ghost Island, we have Chris Noble winning out, and this could be potentially interesting, because obviously I still think Dominic and Wendell will still be in a dominant position, but obviously they would face a lot more adversity. I think first up, you could probably swap him out for Michael. I think his trajectory up until the Michael boot is probably around the same as Michael's. Kellen probably gets taken out a bit earlier. Sebastian might even go out earlier, considering obviously he was close to Chris and they probably wouldn't have wanted them too closely aligned. I do also think Dom and Wendell probably would have taken shots at each other a bit earlier, with Chris winning out, with Dom probably being in the worst position considering his rivalry with Chris. And really, Dom and Wendell would still win at the end against anybody, I feel like, if they were able to get there. However, obviously them taking each other out would decrease the chances of that. And the most probable final 3 is obviously Chris and Angela, and then more than likely getting a fire-making challenge between like Laurel and Donathan at the end. And to be honest, whoever wins that fire-making challenge probably wins the game, considering I don't think Chris was respected and wouldn't have been respected by a lot of the Ghost Island jury, and neither was Angela. So it's like, really, I think Donathan and Laurel would have been fighting for a winning spot at that point. Next up, from David vs. Goliath, we have Elizabeth winning out, and this would have led to a really crazy first tribal where obviously it would have been David vs. Goliath, and Davey would have still had his idol. So again, we don't really know exactly where the dynamics would have played out. However, I do think Elizabeth and Carl were never really going to work together, but let's just assume most of the game plays out similarly, and she gets the end against Nick, Mike, and Angelina. I think at that point, to be honest, I think she would save Nick. Even though Nick is the biggest jury threat at that point, I mean, her and Nick did have a final 2. I don't think Elizabeth is the type of person that would go out of her way to betray that. And really, just at the end of the day, like, I don't know who wins. Like, I would assume Nick would win still, even with Elizabeth there, but it definitely could be up for grabs. From EOE, we do have Joe winning out, and I mean, with Joe winning out here, I mean, Rick, David, Kelly, easy targets early on. We probably get the same endgame people, but you just like swap out Joe with Rick. Chris probably still returns and plays pretty similarly on the return, to where I do think it would have been Chris and Joe, to where I think Chris would probably beat like Gavin in fire making, and at that point it'd be Joe versus Chris at final tribal, where like, again, which one do you respect more, the person who won out from the merge on, or someone that came back into the game and played really hard? I think it would have been a big debate. That, to be honest, I'm not really sure exactly how that goes. Next up, from IOI, we do have Kelly Kim winning out. And really, I mean, who knows how this plays out? I mean, Jamal's probably the merge boot, but beyond that, it's really tough to gauge. I mean, Tommy and Lauren obviously end up running the game, but the game just would play out so differently with Kelly there, especially considering how big of a player Kelly is. I think Kelly would probably win at the end, especially considering she had like these 2 idols to make big moves with. I would very much expect Kelly to make big moves along the way. And this was mostly a game-centric jury, to where I do feel like Kelly would be respected by the end. But again, to actually predict exactly who and how things played out would be just a lot of speculation here that's not really worth getting into. Next up, for Survivor Winners at War, we have Wendell winning out, and I think this is another one that's very tough to gauge, because like I think Adam and Nick are probably early boots here, but beyond that, I mean, we obviously had these like kind of 2 sides with like Kim, Jeremy, and Tyson leading one side, then the Tony, Ben, Sarah group. I think Wendell's more inclined to side with the Kim, Jeremy, Tyson side of things, to which like he could potentially give them numbers moving forward. Also, like, Tony could have been a double agent between those two sides where both sides thought they had him. And, like, really, again, there's a lot of variance here. However, I do think the win equity for Jeremy and Kim goes up significantly at this point, with them both being very well respected and both of them having more allies, particularly Jeremy at this point, to where I don't know if Wendell was ever actually taking Jeremy to the end, but this definitely would have allowed Jeremy to get further into the game, to where, again, he's a very likely winner if he gets to the end. Now for Survivor 41, where, again, I'm going to consider Sydney the merge boo. Again, I know people say, oh, it's not a merge, but I really don't care. So Sydney wins out here. Again, I think Evie's booted at that first tribal. Would have been a pretty easy vote at that point, considering there wouldn't have been an easy person to split the vote on, and also Xander was pretty unwilling to play his idol at that point. And beyond that, I think Tiffany is definitely next. I could definitely see Xander being booted in the Evie spot. At that point, though, to be honest, at that point, he would also have his idol. So again, that definitely adds some variance. But Sydney could really just go all over the place in this post-merge. She obviously had a really good relationship with Danny and good enough one with Deshawn, where like maybe she sides with them, but seemed to also be very willing to flip. So again, like exactly where the endgame goes, it's a bit unpredictable, but I would expect her to not save Erica at the Final Four, to which Erica would probably lose in a fire-making challenge. And I think it's not super unlikely that she would get to the end against like a Deshawn and a Heather, or maybe again, like maybe swap out Deshawn for Danny, considering that would give Danny a bit more leverage. But I do think Danny and Deshawn were more likely to win in this scenario, considering I don't think Sydney was that well respected. But it wouldn't have been out of the realm of possibility for Sydney to potentially get the votes of like the old Yasa. And with like the animosity from like Shan and Ricard against Deshawn, I do feel like Sydney could definitely pull it out there. Now for the final season we'll be talking about in Survivor 42, where here we have Lydia winning out all the way to the end of the game. And I mean, I think the merge boot here becomes pretty simple. I think at that point, Tori is the boot. Obviously, Tori was going to be the boot had she not won immunity. So again, that's an easy one there. I think Chanel's probably still the boot immediately afterwards. And I think the split tribal is where it gets a bit iffy. Let's just say that Lydia takes Tori's spot, as obviously Tori wouldn't be there. The tribal that Drea and Marianne play their idols in a position where Roxroy and Chanel were still probably booted back to back. That probably means that it now becomes between Lindsay and Jonathan on who goes home there, due to those being the only two not immune. In that scenario, I think Jonathan is probably the one voted out over Lindsay. And I guess moving forward, we could just say that Lydia's in the Jonathan position, I guess. Where obviously she's a number for high during the high boot, but like I don't know if she could really do much there. Drea probably still goes home immediately afterwards. Omer's probably still blindsided, though realistically, who really knows what Lydia's going to do there? And really, I feel like Lydia is just such a massive wild card, especially once High is out of the picture, where I really don't know what Lydia would actually do, but considering her and Marianne seem to have at least somewhat of a connection, and also her connection to Mike, I wouldn't be surprised if she just gets the final three with those two, to which she would probably lose. I don't think Lydia was someone that was very well respected, and I don't think she really had it in her to really make the moves that she needed to make and show the jury she was really playing the game outside of winning challenges, I guess. I think Marianne or Mike would still win this final tribal scenario anyway. But there we go. I mean, that is every season of Survivor US talking about what if the merge boot won every immunity challenge. Again, mostly an exercise on whether or not I feel like the merge boot could have won if they made it to the end. But I obviously expect more Survivor Big Brother videos down the road. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.